Hey, a little bit too tired to read? That's not a problem. I can narrate this one for you. So, political pandemics. Vast swaths of humans becoming infected by a microorganism, such as a virus, is what we call a pandemic. And it is important to notice that it shares a very strong parallel with pandemics of a political nature, which are ideological movements, or revolutions in a word. There is quite an interesting link to be made between the psychological impacts of biological phenomena and the socio-political, economic, and cultural trends of our modern era, because we have entered a revolution in worldwide communication, which seems to amplify such impacts. In the interest of making sense of the statement that I just said, it would require that we take a look at each element mentioned in a more raw manner by giving them categories. The mind-body duality, which is all about psychology and biology, the individual versus societal relationship, sociopolitics, and technology, which is all about communication and economics. These categories set up a better avenue for understanding the interrelationships we require if we are to solve the very complex, abstract, and consequently difficult problems that arise from epidemics of any kind. Therefore, it is much more so important when the biological kind, such as corona, finds itself coupling with the political kind. So, the mind-body duality. Beginning with this more fundamental category, it is strange to resume or presume that it's right away with a mere maxim. However, doing so sets the pace in a way that allows us to derive more information about what it means. Dr. Carl Gustav Jung wrote, "People do not have ideas, ideas have people." A very profound insight into the psyche of the human mind, and very telling of the connection between our thoughts and our actions. Here I refer to the relationship between how we behave with our bodies as a result of our ideologies, which most people all too often consider abstract and perhaps inconsequential. Yet nothing there could be further from the truth. What we believe determines the outcomes of entire nations, the course of history, and the future reality we all must come to experience. Now, bringing in a more concrete example here, I do not wish to be too cheap by using the toilet paper craze, but it does give us a baseline for extrapolating future predictions by asking, if people believe that hoarding necessities will preserve their physical well-being, what kind of impact will the belief in needing to preserve their ideologies cause? About 2 months into a pandemic like this, and we had already begun to see the political impacts of ideologically possessed groups, meaning pretty much everybody. And all of them were moving towards action to preserve either mind or body. Now here I'll set up a characterization only in the interest of not opening up a digression, but in short, we can say that people on the left tend to push for the preservation of life, whereas on the right we find a push for preservation of the necessities for life. Businesses, freedom, etc. And so clearly, the same old political struggles are now motivated by a much more primal reason, because we've come face to face with our existential reality as human beings. We must survive. This is a stark contrast to the usual desire to preserve our way of life. And yet both go hand in hand, especially if one considers how life will start to look after an event such as this. Therefore, we can definitely expect greater dangers in all things due to our nature and tendency to be ideologically possessed. And now that we have a strong biological motivation behind such possession, the consideration of who and what we are as human beings, how our minds work, and how our bodies influence us is not a matter to be taken lightly and should always be considered first. Now, I want to diffuse the impending sense of doom a little bit here by mentioning how ideologies do not just drive us towards dangers, but also towards prosperity. Religions, after all, are traditionally what have engendered massive architectural feats, sublime works of art, and greater cohesion of vast empires. So as the wisest of rulers do, we should also see ideology as a potential tool as much as it can be a weapon or destructive force. So let's talk about the individual versus societal relationship. Insofar as some want to be free and independent, they still need to rely on societal means to support such freedom and independence. Conversely, those who want to be free and dependent on each other, well, they still need to rely on their own individual skills, innovation, and labor to participate in the exchange of society. Seeing how both sides here share the same fundamental value at the end of the day, the question and difficulty is always to define this value, freedom. If it were not for our differences in tastes, needs, aspirations, ambitions, and desires, there would be no sides, as we would all secure ourselves the freedom of having the same things. On the one hand, to believe this is achievable because we are all fundamentally the same yields the atrocities of the 20th century communism. And on the other hand, belief in the opposite, which is that individually is fractionated on a 1-to-1 ratio and that people have no similarities, it causes anarchic dismantling of structures, leaving power vacuums for more tyrannical ones. So how does this tie into the pandemic? Clearly, we have failed to understand the needs of our population when it comes to medical staff, who require a certain amount of political power to properly allow health systems to communicate vital information. The individual health conditions of various demographics, the economic needs of unions, nations, communities, and individuals with different statuses and more. Such problems stem from the cold truth that we have had difficulties in stabilizing a better political relationship between individual versus societal needs when it comes to the global scale. So any way we slice it, the individual versus societal paradox of sociopolitics will always remain a challenging balancing act until the supply-demand dynamic shifts from the current human-to-human production/consumption cycle to a more futuristic and anticipated scenario of fully automated machine-to-human cycle, although there are arguments for why politics would largely remain the same then. So the intention here is it's only to state that we are in such a transition. We see it because governments are needing to place their citizens in a kind of universal basic income, and businesses need to optimize their workflow structures to accommodate online work. Surely these events will change how people see the possibilities, and indeed the necessities afoot when it comes to retooling our economic means of production. It certainly would not be surprising to see a greater push for AI and robotics in the market when we reboot. This all gives way to the fact that technology is the primary driving force behind political trends. We've already seen this happen before the epidemic, as with the scandals like Cambridge Analytica and the increasing C-SPAN Congress meetings between CEOs of tech giants and the US government, who seem to either be cooperating or negotiating to shape policy which best suits the future of humanity. Moving on to technology then. This major force behind economic development, and in turn the political outcome, is what must depend on the quality of our communication channels if we are to guide it into preserving our values. There is an immediate and fundamental problem here. How do we establish global values for humankind? This is a good question which can be answered the same way we've always answered it, which is, in my opinion, culture. This is a little tricky, however, and interesting to notice. Our technology has led us to a system of communication which establishes a global culture, therefore could eventually lead to global values as well. This is a fearful thought when one considers the kind of chaotic and dangerous cultures we see online. From the depraved acts of licking toilet seats to defy quarantine for fame, to the dark web version of a Silk Road for drugs and other disturbing services, we can all agree that we have a challenge to create a healthy and cohesive culture for the planet. So let's look at it on a timeline. The growing pains of the internet went from the logistical problems such as the learning curve of users, search engines, widespread access, and social networks, to a cultural and socio-political struggle involving events that only 10 years ago we would have found very strange. Facebook and Twitter becoming the political platforms. This is disconcerting because the same channels for building our culture is perhaps prematurely also becoming the political agora of our day. So a conclusion in brevity. It's not to be insensitive, but we should also consider how worldwide events such as this have many upsides. After the world wars, things went great for the economy and international relations. Now, this is not to say that we must allow ourselves to suffer the casualties of a worldwide epidemic such as this COVID-19. Especially being that it is more than likely not the first in many to appear as we continue to integrate global traveling systems such as Hyperloop trains. But we must figure out how to use the positive possibilities at hand to leverage ourselves out of the current situation. Taking into account humanity's biological predisposition to be individually reflexive in times when we have a great need to be reflective about the societal scale, we come to see how important it is to avoid a political pandemic of steadfast ideological warfare. This means promoting more thought and consideration online, where individuals can map out the landscape of their lives within the greater global context. Our future is saddled with the task of consolidating our human flaws with our technology in order to pull through the tough economic times we have ahead of us, hoping that we can build a better political culture that paves the road for a stable world. My name is James Serrois. That is what came out. Thanks for listening.